homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. I am in my greenhouse today and I'm getting some seeds started, and I make my own seed starting mix, which is kind of unusual. I have such a large volume of plants that I start that it's much more economical for me to make my own seed starting mix. So I thought I'd bring you along and show you how that worked. And then we're gonna get some seeds in the ground. It's mid-March, which for me is about 8 weeks before my last frost date. And so just about the right time to get seeds started in Southeast Washington. Let's get started. So this is a bucket that Mineral for Cows comes in. I don't raise cows, but I have a neighbor who does. And when these things are empty, they're just trash. And so I noticed one of the other YouTubers I follow was using these for growing things by putting holes in the bottom, and I suddenly realized that my neighbor probably had a bunch of them and said, hey, if you're just throwing those out, I will take them. They're really nice for produce picking. They're really nice for doing things with soil. And so I now have 3 or 4 of them, and I really am grateful to have them. I make my own seed starting soil, and so that's what I'm going to show you here today. I plant a lot of plants. This little greenhouse is 10 by 12, and it will be completely full by mid-season in May when I'm getting ready to plant things out and selling seedlings. And so while I can buy seed starting soil, it's actually quite expensive to do that for the volume that I use. And so I just mix my own. And this recipe is based on a recipe from Eliot Coleman that was used for using soil blockers. And so it's basically the same thing. I have not had great success with soil blockers. I don't love them. And so while I have one, I almost never use it anymore. However, the recipe turned out to be great, and so I still use it. This peat moss has been sitting for a really long time, so it's going to take a little work to get it through this. This grate that this is sitting on, this was a extra from a auction that my husband was able to pick up a bunch of things. And it was originally, there were a whole bunch of different trays inside this machine that was doing soil sifting when they were doing soil tests for a dam that was being built in southwest Colorado. And when they were finished with all the testing that they needed to do, the equipment was just up for auction. And so we ended up buying it. We don't use it for its original purpose. However, I have about 20 of these in different size grates, and it is really, really nice for sifting soil. You can make your own version of this with just a wood frame and some hardware cloth, and I did that for years before I had this, and so that works as well. So I'm layering in my different materials here, and so starting with peat moss, and then this is perlite. And you can usually pick this up at a big box store like Home Depot or Lowe's and get a bag of it for fairly inexpensive. I happened to get a great deal on a very large bag of it from somebody who is getting rid of it as part of an estate sale. And so I might have to buy more by the end of the year, but it's lasted me a couple of years, which has been great. So a layer of perlite. This is a layer of compost, and this happens to be bagged mushroom compost. Our compost that we make here is usually from chicken manure, and it tends to be pretty hot, and I don't want to use that for seedlings because it might be too strong for them. And so I just buy bagged mushroom compost when I see it. The last time I got it, I actually bought 4 or 5 bags, and I still have 2.5 bags left, and it's been sitting for over a year. I'm not worried about it. You'll notice I'm not sterilizing anything, and I have a whole blog post on this. I know a lot of people are all about sterilizing their seed starting mix. I don't. I actually think that if you have healthy soil and you start things out healthy from the beginning, that you don't need to do that. And the biggest problem with diseases with baby plants is overwatering. And once I figured out that I needed to stop overwatering, I solved about 95% of my disease issues. And so I almost never have damping off anymore. Okay, so we have a layer of peat moss, a layer of perlite, a layer of compost. I'm now gonna add a layer of coconut coir. And I actually really like coconut coir for growing, but it's very expensive and hard to get in my area. So I don't use it exclusively. I trade back and forth and do a mix with this and peat moss. And there's a lot of debate about peat moss and whether peat moss is appropriate, whether it's sustainable. Depending on who you read, it's completely fine or it's an environmental disaster. So I try to split the difference and use a little bit of both. But I'm personally not convinced that it's going to be a finite resource, at least out of Canada. So the coconut coir is a more neutral pH. The peat moss is going to be a little bit on the acidic side, and you'll see how I mitigate that in a minute. So the thing about coconut coir is you often end up with a lot of extra just kind of wads of fiber. And you'll notice I'm just pushing all of the big chunky stuff off to the side. What I end up doing is saving this. I put it in a pot, and I use it in the bottom of big pots, like decorative pots for flowers and things. And I use it for the bottom of the pot for drainage. And so this doesn't go to waste, but I don't want those great big chunks in my seed starting mix because, you know, a big rock like that could block a root, a tiny little thread-like root that was trying to reach for some depth in the soil. So I want to filter out that big chunky stuff. All right, so I need a handful of fertilizer. And this is a homemade fertilizer I make myself. It's organic. I will put a link in the description to that process and how I ended up with what I use. Again, a lot of this was trying to save money because I do a lot of this. And then lastly, I'm going to put in a small handful of agricultural lime. And this is going to add a little calcium, but mostly it's going to help mitigate the pH from that peat moss. Because peat moss on its own, if you were to grow in straight peat moss, I think it's a pH between 4 and 5. So it's quite acidic. Okay, so we've got a layer of peat moss, a layer of perlite, a layer of compost, a layer of coir. Now we've got a little fertilizer. I need some actual garden soil. And we happen to have really beautiful garden soil. It is what's called sandy loam. And so you can see it's just lovely. And why am I putting garden soil in my seed starting mix? Because I want all of the minerals and all of the life that is in this soil to permeate my seed starting mix. Rather than trying to keep everything perfectly sterile, which is impossible because there's all kinds of bacteria and funguses that are just floating around in the air. I believe in inoculating my soil with the good guys so that the bad guys don't win. And so that's part of why I'm actually putting actual soil in here. I also believe that it can be a bit of a shock to plants to go from this super perfect mix of garden potting soil, which is mostly just broken down compost, and then suddenly you're put into an actual garden with actual dirt. And that's a very different environment from what they're used to. And so I feel like if I do this, a lot of the bacteria and the minerals and the microorganisms that are all in that soil are going to be in those roots from the very beginning, and that transition to transplanting out is going to be much easier than it would have been otherwise. One more bucket of perlite. More peat moss. So if you're just starting, you know, a couple of flats of plants, it's worth it to just go get some seed starting mix. But I'm literally starting probably 50 flats altogether. And so that's a lot of cost. And so that's why I do it this way. It saves a lot of money in the long run buying bags of peat moss and other things that you need and mixing it together yourself than it does buying actual bags of seed starting mix. And lastly, one more bucket of mushroom compost. And I have a graphic I'll put on the screen here that shows what I do. I made it up a while back to remind myself, and also because sometimes I have some helpers with this, and so it's helpful to have a visual for other people so that they don't get the ratios wrong. But essentially, 3 parts coir or peat moss or some mix of the two, 2 parts perlite, 2 parts compost, 1 part garden soil, and then a little bit of fertilizer. That's the short version. And then I just layer it because it's much easier to mix. All right, now the fun part. And I could make bigger batches of this, but it's harder to hand mix if the batch is bigger. And so I just work in this sized batch and it works out pretty well for me. It really helps to have this up on, I've got this sitting on a small stool. It saves your back. If you're working from the ground, it's very, very hard. All right, so there you go. Beautiful homemade seed starting mix.